The Netherlands used to be one of the most waterlogged nations on Earth, with more than half the country below sea level. Since the 1600s, legions of windmills have powered water wheels that lift water up into canals. These channels flowed back to the sea, which was held at bay by earthen dikes. But this system was not foolproof. In January 1953, hurricane-force winds and an unusually high tide blasted the Dutch coast, collapsing the protective banks. 1,835 people were drowned, and 70,000 were left homeless. A third of the Netherlands was underwater. Over the next 50 years, the country spent billions walling itself off from the North Sea. But for Rotterdam, the biggest port in the world, a permanent barrier would have spelled economic disaster. And so, the Dutch came up with this: 2 mobile gates that can swing out to block the river whenever the North Sea gets out of hand. To withstand the full force of the sea, the structures must be gigantic. Each gate has a steel barrier 7 stories tall, which holds back the water. The arms are as long as the Eiffel Tower is high. The gates are far from subtle, but Pierre Vellinga, environmental scientist, is still a fan.
When the North Sea is rough, we are very vulnerable. And we had the choice between raising all the dikes, 3, 4, 5 meters, and rebuilding part of the old cities, or a one-time mobile barrier. And the population was much in favor of this mobile barrier because it is safer and it has less effect overall on the landscape.
When the sea is calm, the barriers rest in canals on the riverbank. If a major storm is predicted, the huge arms will rotate towards the center of the river until they almost meet in the middle. Then the barriers fill with water and sink into the riverbed. Finished in 1997, the gates haven't been tested against a real storm yet, but it's predicted they will be needed on average once every 10 years. The Dutch system of dams and gates has been hailed as an engineering marvel. But could it work for Venice?
What I know of Venice, the people and the visitors do not like to see such a massive structure. And the design, which is now discussed for Venice, is a more elegant solution.
The Venetian flood plan calls for several sets of mobile gates placed at the 3 large entrances to Venice's lagoon. Most of the time, the steel gates lie flat in a special housing on the bottom of the inlet. When extremely high tides threaten the city, compressed air is pumped into the hollow gates, causing them to tilt upwards to the surface. Each gate measures about 65 feet wide, about 12 feet thick, and 65 to 100 feet tall. They're designed to hold back a high tide more than 6 feet above normal. When in use, they're supported by the water on both sides. After the tide recedes, water flows into the gates, sinking them back into place. If the hollow gates look flimsy, take a peek inside. Each gate is supported by an internal steel framework, weighing between 300 and 400 tons.
The design of the mobile gate system is very innovative. When it's in use, the elements of the barrier are allowed to swing back and forth with the waves. In this way, much of the wave force is transmitted back to the water on both sides and very little force is transmitted to the foundation and to the supporting structure. So in this aspect, I think this is very, very clever.
Many engineers believe these mobile gates represent the salvation of Venice. There's just one problem. They don't exist, except in computer simulations like this. Since the flood of 1966, Italians have been talking about how to protect Venice. Talking and talking.
No, il 21 io ce l'ho già.
But somehow they've been unable to make a decision. Instead, the gates have become a political hot potato, tossed from one administration to the next. And that's meant a lot of tossing. Since 1966, there have been more than 35 different governments in Italy.
The politicians who are sitting in Rome, who essentially have control of this, who are coming and going almost on a yearly or two-year basis, do not have a clear focus on this. They will not be in office when this is done because it will take 10 years. And this helps to explain why you have this sort of inertia.
It's not that nothing has been done. Every now and then, there's a flurry of activity. Like in the late 1980s, when engineers rolled out a full-size prototype of a single gate, which was attached to a large derrick. The whole contraption was ceremoniously hauled along the coastline to gain public support.
On television, they talked about this thing. It's the first time I've seen it.
After years of inaction, Venetians were understandably skeptical.
Oh no, look. As far as efforts to save Venice go, up to now, they haven't tried very hard. They've gobbled up a lot of the money meant for saving Venice, but they've done very little. We hope that now things go well with these mobile gates.
Okay, the politician, they make project, blah, 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 blah. But all the Venetian people now wait.
Today, 14 years later, the Venetians are still waiting. Construction of the gates has not even started. This is particularly frustrating to engineers like Andrea Rinaldo.
In specie in questo paese, in cui l'opinione scientifica,
especially in this country, science and technology take a backseat to politics.
accade in tutto il mondo, ma in un paese sostanzialmente crociano come questo,
It's never intentional. It happens everywhere. But in a humanistic country like this, what an MIT professor says and what a gondolier says is basically the same thing.
è perché qualche centimetro di pelle
And if I say this, it's because I've been burned on this before.
Initially, the gate plan required years of testing. No existing mobile gates operate in this way, popping out from the seafloor by means of compressed air. To make sure the concept would work, engineers spent 4 years fine-tuning the technical design of the single gate module. Then, to test the whole system, they set up several scale models of the lagoon inlets, complete with mini mobile gates. Tiny ripples simulate the effects of a mighty sea storm, and the response of the barriers is carefully noted. During the testing phase, engineers did find a potential problem. When test waves hit the gates in certain patterns, adjoining gates rocked in opposite directions, creating holes through which floodwaters could flow.
This, I believe, was uncomfortable to the designers. But there have been improvements of design by changing the dimension, so this problem is solvable.
By making a few minor changes in the size and angle of the gates, the engineers are confident they'll avoid this problem, and the gates will do their job. That is, if the gates ever get built. Paolo Pirazzoli was born in Venice and has been fighting the gate plan for years.
Il MOSE è un progetto che potrebbe eliminare l'acqua alta.
In theory, the mobile gates with optimal weather conditions could put an end to high tides. But only in theory, because it has a lot of problems. It is an extremely complicated project. It's fragile and expensive in terms of its construction and maintenance, and it would have a negative impact on the environment.
Environmentalists make up the biggest bloc against the gates. They worry that the gates will be closed too often and will damage the lagoon ecosystem. Some insist that Venice and the lagoon would be better off left to Mother Nature. But the gate engineers don't buy that argument.
Negli ultimi decenni si è andata consolidando.
In recent years, there's been a growing sense among people that every intervention in a lagoon and in a city is considered tampering.
Manomissioni.
All these interventions are generally called the disaster of doing.
È difficile condividere questa impostazione.
It's hard for me to agree with this, because it's clear that everything that we see today in the Venetian lagoon, it's the result of an artificial system.
Cioè che sia il prodotto non tanto di evoluzione naturale.
It's not the product of natural evolution, but of a massive interference from humans.
It's true. Humans have been tampering with Venice and its lagoon for hundreds of years. Today, Venice is a collection of built-up islands connected to the mainland by an artificial causeway. But 16 centuries ago, it was a very different place. A bunch of marshes surrounded by a shallow mix of fresh and salt water. The earliest settlers were probably running away from Attila the Hun and other barbarians. They picked this spot precisely because it was so inconvenient. Foreign invaders gave up trying to get there, figuring it wasn't worth the trouble. Only the locals knew the location of channels deep enough for seafaring vessels. Safe from invasion, the ambitious Venetians developed a monopoly on trade and shipping in the eastern Mediterranean. This is what made Venice rich and powerful. But by the 14th century, nature threatened to undo the city's cozy place in the lagoon.
La grande svolta, semplificando, avviene dalla metà del 400.
The big turning point happens in the middle of the 14th century.
Le paludi sembra stiano invadendo le superfici.
It seems that reeds and swamps are invading the lagoon and menacing the city.
Prima di tutto, secondo il punto di vista,
the swamps corrupt the water and bring disease and death. And in addition, they make the city vulnerable to attack.
Several rivers which ran into the lagoon were depositing large amounts of silt. Only a foot or two deep, the lagoon was becoming even shallower and more swamp-like. Mosquitoes and malaria were rampant. Many feared the lagoon would fill in completely, and Venice would lose its best system of defense. So the Venetians decided to take control of their destiny.
Sostanzialmente di procedere a operazioni
Essentially, there is a decision to proceed systematically, to adjust everything that surrounds the lagoon, and to heal the relationship between water and land through constant control.
Un controllo costante.
After much debate, the Venetians launched an enormous public works project. Over the course of 2 centuries, they built a series of large canals, diverting the major rivers around the lagoon so the silt would be deposited elsewhere.